And now turning to today's speaker, it's a pleasure to welcome Justin, who's got a very distinguished CV and various things. Among some, we were just talking about it, for the Nature Conservancy, he was Global Managing Director of Lands. At the World Economic Forum, he was co-head of Nature-Based Solutions. At the Tropical Forest Alliance, which looked for investment in slowing down rates of deforestation, he was Executive Director. And most recently, he was a partner for climate in Al Gore's Generation Investment Management Program, raising hundreds of millions of dollars for investment in climate change and nature. Now, from that sort of CV, you might have an expectation of the type of talk you're going to hear. But actually, in the last year, Justin's been having a lot of thinking about what worked and what hasn't worked in terms of this nature investment, climate investment pathway that he's on. And that's what we're going to hear about today. So I'm really excited to hear your talk. So welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yadvinder. Can you all hear me? Great. So yes, it's wonderful to be here. As Yadvinder said, probably what's most pertinent to today is that I've taken the last 9 months to actually take a step back from my busy, crazy schedule of trying to save nature through finance and technology and policy levers and to really try and reflect on what's working and what's not working. And then that's been a sort of deep path of discovery. And so Stephen just said you seem very nervous, and it's because I actually haven't done a talk for many, many months. So this is me trying to sort of consolidate some of that thinking and learning and the journey that I've been on for those last few months. So I haven't done any of this before, but I hope some of it will be helpful to you. And so what I'm going to do, I was asked to talk about some of the existing approaches and some of the experience that I have done. So I'm going to talk first about understanding what's called the nature finance gap, which is the sort of conventional way of looking at kind of where are we in terms of how much money needs to be invested into nature if we're going to bend the curve and get to the sort of nature positive future that people talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit then about some existing tools and approaches, principally supply chain management, and I'm going to hone in on a case in Brazil and soybeans, and then I'm also going to touch on nature markets. Then I'm going to talk about how we might rethink and reimagine the economy to really sort of move us beyond the existing approaches. And finally, I'm going to talk actually to the sort of deeper work of restoring relationship. And so I'm slightly nervous. I've got too many slides, so I'm going to move through really quite quickly, and then we can come back and have a discussion on any of it. So firstly, I'm going to pull from these next few slides, pull from this great report called State of Finance for Nature. The UN Environment Programme is the lead author of that. I helped them with I was a co-author in their first edition of this in 2021. This is the third edition in 2023. And the high level numbers talk here to the current investment. So the current investment in, clearly haven't done a presentation for a really long time. The current investment is about 200 billion. And that contrasts with what they've calculated here as being the investment that goes in from the conventional economy of nature degrading activities. So that's energy, agriculture, and that's 7 trillion. So that's the difference in terms of how much money is going into degrading the systems of life that we all rely on, and how much is currently categorized as 200 billion. And most of the reporting that came out of this report then talks about how much that needs to scale over the next few years to get to this 542 billion that they estimate is needed by 2030. I've taken a slightly different stance because I want to sort of dig into some of the specifics of the numbers. So this talks about the 200 billion, so the amount of money that is going into nature positive activities. The blue is public sector investment. So much of that is into national parks and public investment. And then the sort of pinky orange is the private finance flows. So there you see the enormous kind of difference between how much the public sector is investing and private sector. So that's totaling 200 billion. The next slide then just touches on how little that represents in most countries in terms of national budgets, how much goes in from governments, from the public purse to support nature recovery. And you see in almost all cases, with Africa being the notable exception, then it's significantly less than 1% goes into support nature recovery. On the private sector side, this is the 35 billion now that's in the report. This is how that breaks down. So you see on the far left, biodiversity offsets and credits. Most of that is wetland banking in the United States. I believe that is one of the few nature markets that that Sophos and others have identified as actually delivering meaningful environmental benefit. And then you go down sustainable supply chains, which I'm going to talk about in more depth in a minute, 8.6 billion, and down through these different ones, carbon markets, which is the one that tends to get the vast majority of the conversation, is actually only 1.5 of that 200 billion, and yet we spend I don't know, a disproportionate amount of time talking about the carbon markets. When you break down the sustainable supply chains, I thought this was interesting. Of that 8.6 billion, this goes into forest certification, the largest of those, certified seafood, coffee, cocoa, you know, these crops that again are so we rely on, but actually the amount of money is tiny that flows into steering those to more sustainable production. I'm going to talk in a moment about soy. And so you see the total annual investment into what's called RTRS, the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, is about $30 million. So a kind of tiny amount of money. So that's just the state of where things are on finance. Nikki, welcome. Nikki was actually one of the authors of that third generation. So thank you for being here. So you understand all of what I've just talked through, but just 200 billion of current investment going into nature-based or positive nature-based solutions versus that 7 trillion that's negative. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the two cases, firstly, sustainable supply chains and then nature markets and what role they might play as we think about nature recovery. And for many folk in civil society, for many folk in private sector, and indeed for many people in government, this is where the vast majority of effort has been spent to try and address the drivers of deforestation and unlock new sources of finance. So that's why these are important areas. So I'm going to touch on soy in Brazil. But just to give you the context of that, this is a graph showing roughly the amount of primary forest that we have lost over the last 20 years each year. So over that time, it roughly is about 3 million hectares per year. In total, that equates to the size of France, we have lost of primary forest over 20 years. So deforestation is this extraordinary challenge for biodiversity loss. It's the biggest challenge of biodiversity loss, and 90% of that, agriculture is the primary driver. There's a great paper in Science that came out last year. I can send the references around. I'm conscious I didn't put it there. So soy is one of the key commodities that the larger environmental sector has spent huge amounts of time and energy focused on. It's an area I've worked very closely on over the last 10 years. And the epicenter of soy production is this extraordinary tropical savanna that surrounds the Amazon in Brazil called the Cerrado. And it's this huge area, the size of sort of half of Western Europe, so a giant area. But here you see at the bottom the amount of loss. So you're losing, 2 million hectares of Cerrado back 10 or so years ago, and then more recently, still 1 million hectares of land. That's a huge amount of land. The reason why this is so important is because from a biodiversity point of view, but also from a sociocultural point of view, this is an extraordinary hotspot of life on Earth and the diversity that has grown up with that in that location. It is also, though, as I said, the epicenter of where soy is produced. And what I want to just highlight for you, and we're going to do a little case in a minute, but is the importance of soybean production, and Brazil as a giant, as now the largest producer of soybeans. And this tracks back now 30 years versus 20 years. But over the last 30 years, you see this extraordinary growth of Brazilian soy production, 780% growth from Brazil soy. Brazil is very proud of that. It's one of they consider themselves one of the breadbasket of the world. They consider themselves the emerging agricultural superpower. The fact that they have now surpass the US in terms of being the largest exporter is a source of incredible pride to many people in the Brazilian government, and indeed many people in the Brazilian nation. They're also proud of it, and they love to point out that for a 780% increase in production, they've only increased the land area by 295%. So they've more than doubled the yield of soy produced per acre or per hectare to be able to power this soy revolution that we've seen in the last 30 years. And here, this map at the bottom just shows the different sort of production. Again, it overlaps almost entirely with the Cerrado that you saw earlier. So this is why this is such an important landscape. And the thing I just want to highlight is that therefore you've got a country that considers this an absolute critical part of its agricultural production, and environmental NGOs who consider this an absolute hotspot of biodiversity and sociocultural diversity, indigenous land stewardship. And so this has been a huge part of where things have played out. And this slide then points to the strategic importance of agricultural exports for Brazil, and particularly the importance of soy. So you see over this period, this is now back to 20 years. So over the last 20 years, agricultural exports have increased from $7 billion to over $100 billion for Brazil, and soy from $4 to $60 billion. So you see soy exports 18% of the total of Brazilian total exports. So that's why they consider this such a strategic sector for themselves. And so the reason I'm using this as a case is that I spent many years, and I know many of you in the room have also worked on this incredibly thorny issue. But when I was at the Tropical Forest Alliance, what we had to do was sit with government, with indigenous people, with companies, private sector companies that were producing it, trading it, retailing it. Soy, for those of you who don't know, soy is in so many of the products that we take for granted because it's the key source of feed for animals around the world. So milk products, meat products have, generally speaking, some soy within those products. So the real challenge, and the Tropical Forest Alliance was this public-private partnership, was how do you bring different parties together to actually resolve the trade-offs and the tensions around producing more soy and protecting more of the environment. So lots of the language that is now used, and these data is from a great report that came out recently from from Systemic and my former team at the TFA on production and protection in the Cerrado. But most of it is about how do we balance this, and that's what we just take for granted. So the role play exercise that I used to do is like ask people to take the different hats that you might wear in this really complex system, and here are just 6 of the hats that you might wear, to actually sit and think, how might you respond or how might you react if you are sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture, MAPA, and you're responsible for increasing agricultural output to the Brazilian economy. If you sit and you are the largest soy trading organization and you're trying to balance the demands of the farmers who have actually just firebombed some of your facility because they think you're caving into international NGOs, versus what your management is trying to sort of push in terms of increasing production. Or you sit and you get to be a panda for the day, and you sit within WWF and how important their sustainable food program is, and thinking about how you can actually do this. And then added in here is the AproSoja, which is the largest trade community, who are, it's probably fair to say, quite militant in terms of defending the rights of Brazilian farmers. And then across on the far right is an indigenous elder. And if we were sitting in a sort of workshop doing this, we could spend a whole hour sort of sitting and actually negotiating across the table with everybody playing these different roles. It's an extraordinary role play to actually get into, because people start to understand the different power dynamics and the different perspectives that are there. And that was the tension that we had to hold while sitting at the Tropical Forest Alliance, because we were trying to represent all of these parties and trying to sort of bring, when we talk about collective action and collaboration, it's easy to say it, but it's actually far harder to do in this sort of real world context of of soy. So that's something, yeah, I'm going to keep moving. I think the thing, though, that for me, and part of the reason I stepped away from that role, was just understanding just the limits of what we could do. We could sort of make incremental progress within this incredibly complex system. But when you step back and you think, what system are we actually solving for? Right? I wonder how much how much I was in service of this incredible industrial machine that has become how much of our agriculture is done on the planet. Because most of what the big NGOs are talking about, most of what certainly private sector is talking about, is how do we intensify agriculture? How do we get more yield of soybeans per acre so we don't have to destroy more forest or more savanna? We can actually produce more soy in that field. So that's what intensive agriculture looks like in the Cerrado. I can't even count the number of combines because they sort of extend too far into the back, but that's what large-scale production of soy now looks like in the Cerrado. Who knows what that picture on the right might be? It is swine production or pig production. Okay, this is not to highlight China here, but this happens to be the largest indoor pig farm in the world. It's called Hubei Chongqing Highway Modern Farming. The Chinese are very proud of this. Pork and pig products play a huge role in China's national diet, as China's economy has surged in growth over the last 40, 50 years. The amount of protein consumption has gone up very, very significantly. And so to intensify agriculture there and to deal with various things like African swine flu, which hit a huge part of Chinese pork production a few years ago, they've now got these vast interior pig farming productions. That's a 26-story pig farm in a large inner city in China. The amount of effluent that comes out of there, you can't see it, but the amount of effluent that you're then having to deal with, the amount of methane that exists in that building, the safety concerns of doing all of that. But there are 200,000 pigs a day slaughtered in that one building. Okay, so the reason for soy production in the first place is to feed this industrial agricultural system that we have, that everybody has got these very, very different perspectives on. Okay, and so if you're sitting in the system, within the context of that system, it's really difficult to step out of actually what the hell are we solving for? And not to criticize Brazilian farmers or not to criticize Chinese farmers or Chinese consumers. It's just an incredibly complex system that we have created, that we are trading. And sorry, so the soy production, 80% of soy from Brazil goes to China to feed the pigs, the poultry, to some extent the dairy herd for the milk production. So that's why the Brazil-China connection is so incredibly strong. So just to, I'm not giving any answers here. I'm explaining how complex this system is and what we're trying to solve for in terms of what are the environmental issues we're actually solving for, what are the food security issues we're solving for. So I'm going to move on and then talk about nature markets. How am I doing on time? I'm going to have to speed up. Nature markets, carbon markets, as one example of that, have been the focus of a huge amount of media attention. The reason being is you've seen this huge surge in the voluntary carbon market over the last few years. I haven't actually put up the 2023 numbers, but they sort of flattened. But you see that huge surge, and much of that was driven because corporates, in a race to demonstrate their climate credentials, all made these net zero commitments, largely in the run-up to the Glasgow Climate Summit in November 2021. So companies were saying, how do we meet our net zero commitments? The only way we're actually going to be able to do that is by, yes, we need to reduce our emissions, but we're also going to need to buy some carbon offsets to compensate for our emission footprint. And so that's what you see. And Delta Airlines is one example. They used to be one of the largest purchasers of that. And understandably, lots of people then screamed, how on earth can flying and Delta's purchase of all these of all these offsets be something that fits within a broader high ambition climate action. And so huge amounts of criticism of Delta in particular, that corporates shouldn't be able to do this. And so the challenge and the tension that has sat within the carbon market world, the environmental NGOs have been torn in the middle. Often there have been people that have been fighting across the aisle within the same NGOs about what is the right role and how much should corporates be able to do. So there's, again, we could spend half an hour just talking about these two questions, but for me, it's a question of, at one point it was like the additional flow of money, to support nature recovery that currently is so underfunded. Is that a good thing? And then does the corporate greenwashing that we see, does it matter? It's all voluntary. They're all trying to edge their way forward. And actually some of the recent data that's come out says those corporates that have made those commitments have actually been some of the highest ambition companies, because there are a vast number of companies, probably 90% or more of companies, who quite happily don't want to say anything about their climate commitments, will quite happily carry on business as usual without doing anything. And it's the companies who try to at least do something that have then got hammered and knocked for making these commitments. It's an incredibly complex area, and I've just simplified that. But that's part of the tension of how and where we bring new financing in, where the demand for these credits comes from. But what I want to then talk about is one case example, which is a case that it means quite a lot to me, because over 10 years ago, I sat on the board of a young carbon developer called South Pole. And at the time, the carbon market was cratering. It was absolutely tanking. Most of the carbon developers went out of business altogether. South Pole stuck with it and they stayed through. And I, sitting on their board, probably in 2010, I said to them, you need to be getting involved in forests and this emerging scheme called RED, because you can't be a carbon developer and not have a RED project. So they got involved. The first project they got involved with was this project called Kariba. And so that was back in 2010. I came off their board, I think, in early 2012. The project wasn't sort of doing anything in 2012. It was just starting to kind of get to its first delivery in 2013, which you can actually see on this blue chart, 1.94 million tons. But the fact it was delivering tons in 2013 didn't mean a great deal, because back on that voluntary carbon market chart, there wasn't any demand for credits. So they weren't really able to sell those credits. Fast forward, though, to 2020, 2021, suddenly all these corporates are buying credits. South Pole, has now become a sort of big giant company. South Pole jumps in and says, well, I've got all these credits, and you can sell the vintage credits as well. So they had all these vintage credits in store going back to 2013. So they sold many of these credits to big companies like Deutsche Post, like DHL, like Apple, that bought these credits from South Pole as a key, as a sort of leading carbon developer. And it's a vast area. This project is 784,000 hectares. It's a vast area, really important for biodiversity. And the purpose of the project was to try and reduce the amount of deforestation that was going on in this. And this, I should have said, this is on the southern shores of Lake Kariba in Zimbabwe. So, potentially a really important, really critical project, and a demonstration of how this mechanism called RED, reducing emissions for deforestation degradation, should happen. For those of you who read The Guardian and many others, then you may then find out that the story doesn't turn out quite so well, because what actually happens is this becomes the biggest shit show of a project in carbon market history. I just wanted to pull out some of the numbers that came out of this project, and where I went from being continue to be a supporter of this to the more I dug in and understood, then I became a very vocal critic of the project and of the management of how they got there. So the project is actually based on avoided deforestation, as I talked about. But the biggest challenge that you have in these projects is the baseline that you set, okay? And the baseline was massively inflated. So they assumed that you were going to continue to lose large and large amounts of forest In fact, all of the surrounding area showed that the drivers of deforestation had slowed, and that, in fact, this interesting geospatial company called Chloris Geospatial has recently demonstrated, I got a demonstration on this earlier this week, that rather than this being an area where there was deforestation happening, this was an area where actually forest growth was starting to occur. So over the 20-year period, they have measured that 4 million tons of additional carbon came back into the landscape. So that's quite a good thing. And if South Pole had been smarter, and if the standard bodies had actually been more flexible, there's a good story in that landscape to potentially be able to tell from a nature recovery perspective. But that wasn't the business. That wasn't what South Pole were actually doing. They were claiming the avoided deforestation delivered all of these 25 million credits, 25 million tons of CO2 avoided because the project existed. So that was a huge inflation of the baseline. The Vera methodology I'm not going to get into, but they are far from faultless in all of this. And so you had massive inflation of how this project worked. And then the thing that really got me was the profiteering that actually then occurred, because $100 million, give or take, of revenue came to South Pole from the sale of those credits over the last 5 years. South Pole, at one stage on their website, talked about $18 million of profit that South Pole itself had made from this project. They transferred then to a company run by a white Zimbabwean guy called Wenzel, who ran CGI. They were the developer on the ground. South Pole started to say, well, we don't know all of what they've done. South Pole didn't have any controls, but they transferred $57 million, I think, to CGI. And the Wenzel is now trying to say that $14 million went to the communities to support and to support local action. And he has only been able to provide receipts for $4.5 million. So there is this huge challenge of, if we are creating this type of value from these landscapes, even if if the carbon was even real, the fact that South Pole took so much profit and the communities got so little benefit, for me, is no different from any model from extractive industries that have played a role around the world for the last several hundred years of going and exploiting resources and then profiteering, and the money staying in the hands generally of northern stakeholders. And so this, for me, is the very worst kind of project. The New Yorker produced some excellent coverage that was published in October last year. It's a great article if you want to read more on it. But this has had huge reputational consequences for the market, for the company. All of the management has effectively been removed. I think they are now at a point where they laid off 30%. I think there's an additional layoff. So, I mean, dreadful for people who've been working in the company for trying to kind of support climate action. And then a huge turnoff for how the whole market can work in corporate purchases. So it's the worst kind of market abuse that I can find of. I'm going to change gear and now talk about a different market, something else I know is close to many of your hearts, which is the biodiversity net gain market. So unlike the voluntary market we just talked about, this is a regulated market. It came into force in the UK in February of this year. And there are examples of how this could really work for nature and be beneficial. And again, I haven't got time to get into all the details of it, but I also have the great privilege to chair something called the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment, which has been working to pilot projects on biodiversity net gain in Oxfordshire over the last few years. And here are two projects that are now live. One is in Duxford, which is in the Upper Thames. That is a site run by BBOUT, the local wildlife trust. It's an extraordinary rewilding project on the left-hand bend of the river, the left meander of the river here. This is already an existing nature reserve called Chimney Meadows. Highly recommend it just for going to walk at a weekend. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And there you see the sort of the slow rewilding of that project. So that's 38 hectares. Contrast that with the 784,000 hectares that I just talked about with the Kariba project. So it's a tiny amount of area. It's going to deliver about 250 units. But those units can now be bought by housing developers to support that. So TOW supported BBOUT develop that project. We took the first 15% of the units and have sold those into the market. And I think wrote a check to our largest ever check was to BBOUT for 420,000 pounds. So, you know, starting to get large amounts of money moving towards nature recovery locally. This is one we're very proud of because this was actually just registered on the National Registry last week. It was the third project nationally that was registered at Loatmead, run by a private farm. And this is on the River Thames. So there's the Thames running through there, key tributary of the Thames. And again, you see the scrapes that's starting to kind of restore wetland in that project. So it's an incredible, it will deliver genuine biodiversity and about 120 units and 27 hectares, right? A couple of observations. In the grand scheme of things, it's a tiny amount of land, but delivering real benefits. But the benefits are largely going to accrue to people who own the land, and so BBOUT owns large amounts, or pretty, you know, generally speaking, quite a large amount of land, but most of the land is privately owned. Some of the bigger projects we're working on are with hedge fund managers who own large land in Oxfordshire and are going to, you know, deliver great benefits for biodiversity, but in areas that are largely cut off from people because we don't have any relationship with that land. So there's a whole other conversation around that. But just to highlight that these markets can work, they can deliver benefits. But I think the team and people who know more about this than I do, but most of how biodiversity net gain will be delivered will be gained by the market, will be driven to the lowest common denominator, will be a few bat boxes and owl boxes on the side of large scale developments, because private sector will generally go to the lowest cost of how they can deliver that. So just two contrasting examples of how nature markets work. You've then seen this kind of huge surge of interest of funds that have come along to try and start monetizing this. Don't try and read all the detail of it. It's just to say there's a lot happening and many companies, many funds starting to develop. The work that I did with Generation was to build this multi-$100 million fund that they are now actively out fundraising on. They will raise more than 500 million. Lots of that can be deployed and can be deployed for genuine nature recovery, but also in the grand scheme of things, these are tiny amounts of money that are moving, and there's other concerns that sit there. So some reflections for me is nature finance and how these markets are working will continue to be a reality. It is the economic construct that we're in. You're going to see these nature markets coming. Integrity and quality is improving, right? The Kariba case is an outlier of just how bad things can be, and an example of how private sector, even when the intention is good, because the founders set that company up because they genuinely wanted to do some good for the climate, but the integrity and quality is improving, and there will be benefits, or can be benefits, from nature. Voluntary markets, I think, do have a role, but regulated markets then become critical. So they remain an important tool for system transition. They're an important effort. There are now, I can't even imagine, I can't even think how many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people work on this, right? They're all beavering away. But remember back to the climate, the nature finance work at the beginning, just the tiny amount of money actually in real terms that's there. And I just hate to think how many hours of my life I've spent trying to get these markets to work just a little bit better so we can have more integrity. But that's the reality of where we are today. So they're important, but far from sufficient for the deeper transformation that we need. So now, as I think about, you know, moving more into where I've been over the last few months of really trying to rethink and reimagine, because again, we have an economy that is putting 7 trillion each year into nature negative activities and only 200 into nature positive activities. The gap that's identified is this sort of, we've got to scale it to 542 billion, but actually, yeah, there's still this huge destruction going on to feed the type of industrial systems and industrial levels of consumption that we have baked into our economy today. So the example of deforestation we've touched on. Who knows what this picture is at the bottom? Any guesses on picture prize? No, although I wanted to include the Thames Water example, and I just I didn't have time. That is a lithium production facility down in Chile. Okay, so all of the hype around electric vehicles and how electric vehicles are going to save the world and how we're going to sort of, right, the scale of lithium production that is now focused, particularly in this sort of triangle of Chile, northern Argentina, and Bolivia, is astonishing. And the environmental consequences of that are not really that different from some of the big hydrocarbon projects. It's a vast extractive industry that is going to fuel this surge in interest for batteries and electric vehicles. And that's not me knocking electric vehicles, but again, to understand the complexity of these supply chains and systems that we often don't think about. So this is, to my mind, resulting from humanity believing itself separate to nature. We see nature as a resource that we can continue to exploit. We commoditize, because when we commoditize, we can scale, and we see the market as the mechanism for how we can actually shift the economic incentives to do this right. I think there's deeply flawed logic. Many people have talked about that far more eloquently than I. But I just pulled out a couple of quotes here from this great book by Michael Sandel, published in 2012, that the real problem is not an increase in greed. The real problem is that we are now using markets to try and solve the problem for everything. And the real question is, how do we want to live together? What sort of society do we want to build? Because we have allowed this neoliberal economic fundamentalism to drive almost every decision in political and economic circles. And so this is a great quote that I'm sure you've seen before, attributed to many people, but the earliest I can find is a guy called Mark Fisher, who wrote, "It is so much easier now to imagine the end of the world." We see it on the news and in newspapers and anywhere you pick up your media these days, than it is the end of capitalism, right? We believe capitalism is the system that it functions and it does all the things we want. And so I think the greatest travesty is that capitalism has actually captured our imaginations, because we cannot see beyond the bounds of the system that we are currently stuck within. And so this is a simplistic but I think helpful representation. On the left-hand side is where I spent the last 25 plus years of my career trying to balance what was called the triple bottom line of how do we have society and economy sitting alongside society and environment sitting alongside the economy. And we've talked, how do we balance these things? And again, we go back to the same conversation that we were talking about when I was touching on soy, trade-offs. And inevitably, the trade-off has been that, well, society and nature actually are going to lose, because driving the economy, creating the jobs, creating the GDP, creating the economic export is what has is almost driven every decision. And so the only way we can solve this is actually to start to remember that the economy is a subset of society. The economy is here as a tool to support the well-being of all of society, and that it is a subset of nature, because if we extend beyond the boundaries of the planetary boundaries, as Johan Jochum's work talks about, eventually we are falling off a cliff. And right now that's the trajectory we are on. So that's a big reason for me why I stepped back from the system 9 months ago, just to try and reimagine how might this work. So lots of system tools that are out there. This is one of my favorites, called the Bacana two-loop model, which is that we've got to start understanding and really reflecting, how do we help drive down the decline of some of the dominant system, which is continuing to drive some of the industrial scale production that I sort of touched on today. Because and it doesn't mean that we need to, it's finding a way to engage with these sectors, but at the minute, those sectors are actually digging their heels in and doubling down on business as usual. And so one of the greatest challenges we've got is the huge polarization of all of these discussions, because people see it as this sort of threat to their very life. And then at the same time, we are not supporting all the things that are actually starting to try and emerge that could offer a very different way of how we would live for the future. And like any system in nature, if you're not actually recycling the nutrients of the decay at the end of every year, in every winter, if we're not recycling those nutrients to actually support what needs to grow, it's no wonder that the things that are really popping up and trying to grow are struggling so much. So much more I could say on that. But here's just a couple of examples. I'm not going to get into the detail of them, but a couple of examples of thinking beyond market-based mechanisms to think how might we drive nature recovery. So this is one called conservation basic income. It's from a great paper that came out last year from Lang et al. And it's basically along the same lines of universal basic income that says, how can we actually put money into the hands of local communities so they become the stewards of these resources, rather than thinking we've got to monetize each and every ton, and not only monetize, we've got to be measuring it and ensuring it to ensure that the quality is there as it's needed. They calculate that roughly that this could be anything from, to the numbers on the right-hand side, from about 350 billion per year, this could be rolled out globally. So again, if that's not outside the realm of possibility, when you think back to the numbers that were there right at the beginning in terms of how much money currently is going to nature positive. Enabling commoning. A topic that I have become more and more deeply convinced by, which is actually to sort of recover our sense of common resources and common stewardship of resources. And so here's just an example of community-supported agriculture, where people come together to support local scale and smaller scale agriculture, and community land trusts that offer so much potential for how communities can come together to steward land. Questions of how that's supported, how that's resourced, it may well link to what I just touched on in terms of conservation basic income, but these ideas of actually bringing solutions to the local level, and the communities who live at the local places know what is needed to actually drive things forward. And then one example that starts to bring this to life for me, a project I've got very close to called Action Andena. It's a collaboration between a local Peruvian NGO called EcoAn and Global Forest Generation. And they've started in Peru, but that's now across 7 countries of the Andes. And what I really love about it is, instead, this is not a market-based mechanism. This is working with these communities to actually restore their cultural heritage and their cultural connection to the lands that their ancestors have lived on for centuries and centuries. So you now have about 30,000 people working across 200 communities in these 7 countries, going out and working together to restore. This is the high montane forest of the Andes. This spirit of collective action called Aini and Minca is at the center of this. This is a sort of philosophy of how they relate to the land, this deep ancestral calling that they feel. And a huge driver for this, which is where they're now getting support from governments as well, is that the glaciers of the Andes are melting at this extraordinary rate. And so a huge driver of this is in restoring the forest. They are restoring or securing the water towers of these mountains, for which all of their communities depend. And they know that without water, there is no life. More I could say on Action Andena, but it's the type of large-scale example that steps outside beyond the market. And there's some great examples of where carbon developers come along, private sector developers come along, and are trying to pick off individual communities and saying, we'll buy carbon from you. And at the minute, these communities and this bigger movement that is there is holding strong and saying, no, we want to work as part of this bigger collective effort to actually restore the forest, because we are working together as a community, and we are restoring our cultural our cultural heritage. And there you see the picture of one of the work parties going out into the mountains. So just one example, but it's an example that provides a nice segue to the last piece that I want to talk about, which is really, I think, core to this, because so many people ask the question, well, this all sounds lovely, but how are you actually going to go about changing the economic system? We're trapped within this. We've got, and the answer for me is the only way we're going to find our way back is to get out of our heads and to start really getting into our hearts, to start getting into a sort of whole sort of body sense of how do we need to think differently about this. And I am, this is not news to any of you, but this chart is, I think, incredibly useful, that I suspect everybody in this knows the critical role that Indigenous people play in stewarding biodiversity. And so the about 6% of the global population, a huge amount of poverty, certainly measured by existing financial or conventional financial terms, about 20% of the Earth's territory, but remarkably 80% of the remaining diversity, biodiversity on the Earth is stewarded by that 6% of the population. So two things I just say on that. One is I'm not trying, there are also complexities and challenges within Indigenous communities. They have suffered enormously over many hundreds of years. I don't want to idealize that either, and nor do I want to trivialize some of the challenges they have. And clearly a huge amount of work that now goes on across the environment and the development sectors is how do we support their stewardship and their right to the land that's there. But I'm also asking a deeper question of, well, if they steward that much biodiversity, if they have that amount of relationship with the land, that amount of biodiversity is there, what can we learn from that? And this is a story that for me really came to life in August of 2018, because I took a group of the Nature Conservancy's executive leadership, about 25 people, and we went and sat in council at the invitation of the elders of the Haudenosaunee Nation, which are the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy that used to steward or be the custodians of a large part of the northeastern United States and the southern part of Canada along the St. Lawrence Seaway and above. And it was the most extraordinary 3 days. Lots of people, lots of the executive team from the Conservancy were freaking out because there were no mobile phones and there was no agenda. So it was a sort of very unusual meeting, but it was the most powerful meeting I think I've ever been part of, because we just sat around a fire for 3 days and listened and told story and listened some more and built relationship both with the peoples of the Haudenosaunee nations, but also in a deeper way with each other, and starting to be with the more than human life that was also supporting that. And this is a picture of an extraordinary man called Chief Oren Lyons. He's now in his 90s, I think he's 93, a traditional faith keeper. And I just pulled out 3 quotes that have, these were conversations that he either had in the whole group or he had directly with me. But one that really stuck out for me was, be wary of putting your faith into the same tools that created this system. Because the very first week that I joined the Nature Conservancy and presented to the board, the tools that I was talking about as a global managing director were that we were going to be working with technology and policy and finance, and this was how we were going to solve these great problems. And here you have a traditional faith keeper telling me, be wary of these tools. And I don't think I fully understood what he meant, and I'm sure I probably still don't fully understand what he meant. The invitation was to find a way back into relationship with your land, with my land. I had asked a question, very worried about appropriating Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous culture, and what does that mean to not be in an appropriation of that? And the answer was very strongly, you need to find a way back into relationship with your land so that we can actually then have a real conversation with you about a path forward. And again, I didn't fully understand what he had meant at that point, but that's been a big part of my journey over the last 6 years. And then the last quote was, in the last afternoon on the 3rd day, these giant thunderheads sort of built up and came, and this huge storm and the winds built up, and everybody sort of packing up and trying to sort of run away from this fire that we'd sat around for 3 days. And Oren Lyons, the eldest of the elders, who was sitting there saying, we must not run, because this is the earth speaking to us. This is our grandfathers, this is our grandmothers speaking to us, and we need to listen. And yet nobody, I'm sure people listen, but my reflection is we all just upped and we ran a few hundred meters to a covered area where we then finished the meeting. We had a lovely meeting, but that invitation to not run when the weather was really coming in, and feeling what the wind and what that rain and what the lightning might mean to us, was just a real lesson for me of like, how in my comfort, in my privilege, how often Am I really listening to what is happening in the world around? And this is a quote that then goes back, because Indigenous peoples have been trying to tell us this for many years. This is a quote from Chief Seattle back in 1854, when he gave a quote, or when he gave a speech rather, to say that the earth does not belong to man. You know, we are connected as the blood runs through all of life, and that what we are is just a strand of the great web of life. We are not some master of the web of life. And yet the entire economic system, all the things that I talked about in the first part of my discussion, are because we are in the left-hand side model here. We are in this egocentric, anthropocentric view that we are somehow above the rest of life. And I think as long as we continue to position ourselves at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the heap, we will continue to have more and more inequality. We will continue to have more and more degradation until we find our way back into actually more of what is described as an ecocentric worldview, where we are just a part of, we are just one of the strands of this web of life. None of this is easy, none of this is straightforward, but this is the deeper thinking, the deeper work that I've been on over the last few years. And this is not just relationship. You know, it sort of comes up in so many different ways. So this is a lovely quote from a guy called Nicholas Baer, who's a poet and a native of the Cerrado. So that picture of those giant combines that were there, this quote from him talks, the soybean makers are amazingly efficient. We've already touched on that, because they have no sentimental link to the Cerrado. For them, it's just soil to be planted. They are outsiders, not children of the soil. And that is what contributes so much to the destruction. Okay, so as long as we have lost our relationship to where we are from, as long we have severed our link to the natural world, to the recognition that we are part of nature, we're not separate from nature, we will continue to drive the types of industrial scale systems, the types of markets that drive separation, that push people off the land. And that is a key part of where we are. So for me, the question I've been sitting with is, what if a key part of our work now is to be stepping back into relationship to where we are actually from, right? To remember we are kin with all of life, to figure out how we fall back in love, to fall back fiercely in love with all of life, and recognize how dependent we are on all of life, and not in some sentimental, soppy way, but in some really fierce way that we are also willing to defend that, and to remember our place within the web of life, that we are a custodian species, as all Indigenous people tell us, and that we as custodians finally find a way of stewarding life and helping support healthy ecosystems, because the other myth of the conservation world is that we have to leave nature alone, whereas native peoples from around the world would also tell you, no, nature, and where humans are working in close proximity nature, and one of the best examples of this is in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is when we are not cultivating the sweetgrass, when we are not cutting the sweetgrass, then the plants wither. And yet I think it was USDA put a ban on the harvest of sweetgrass, because that was how they thought they could protect the plant, and the population plummets even further. So Robin, who's an extraordinary woman, extraordinary botanist, extraordinary Indigenous leader, talks about this weave of how we come back into relationship, bringing Western science together with Indigenous and traditional knowledge, and finding new paths forward. So again, I'm not trying to say we need to ditch all of the modern thinking, all of the modern science we have. On the contrary, but we need to listen to these traditional custodians and Indigenous peoples who have found a way to live, in the case of Aboriginal people in Australia, for 60,000 years, through ice ages, through multiple climatic changes, and found a way to thrive and continue to flourish and continue to support societies through multiple generations and multiple millennia. And right now, Homo sapiens, right, if we are really to live up to our self-branded name as the wise two-legged, right, we have to desperately change. We have to change course really quite soon if we're going to find our way back into relationships. So what I then have started to do is say, how can we create experiences for people to come back into a deeper connection with nature? And this is a gathering that we held last week for a group of people working across nature recovery, from finance, from communications, from law firms, from environmental NGOs, and we gathered in the woods of Sussex. Who knows what that bird is? Common nightingale. Thank you, Tom. And so we gathered to listen to nightingales, but not only to listen to nightingales, but where we had musicians who were our hosts, a wonderful folk musician called Sam Lee, who hosts this event down in Sussex, and we gathered to then go out and listen to the nightingales in the dark of night. It was May Day, it was Beltane, so there was the Beltane fires. I'm sure many of you were with the May Day celebrations here in Oxford earlier in the morning. But we then went out and we had the most extraordinary display. It was the night of the giant electric storm, so we could see electric storms lighting up the whole night sky, whilst we then listened to musicians singing with the nightingales in a way that humans have done, as mythology and story and legend tells us, throughout Eurasia over centuries. Persian myths talk of nightingales actually teaching humans how to sing originally. And so I've got a little recording of the, do you want to just press? I don't think we'll do very much if you could, but a little recording of that. So maybe just close your eyes for a second and actually just picture yourself in the woods with this extraordinary bird and these extraordinary musicians. So I could let you all drift off into a deeper reverie, but and it's really hard if you're not there to sort of be able to experience the true wonder and the true awe of what happened in the woods that night. But the extraordinary thing is the quality of the conversation that then opened up for people to be able to get into, of what and how we could think about nature recovery, because the scientific story for the nightingale is that in my lifetime, so I'm much older than many of you in the room, but in 50+ years, we have lost 90% of the nightingale population in the UK. So biodiversity loss is not something that just happens a long, long way away. We are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And this bird that has the most extraordinary, the largest vocal range of any bird, to be in that deep relationship with it and to be with these singers. And if I carried on playing it a little longer, there's an extraordinary violinist who then jumps in to start, and the nightingale starts to play back with the violinist. But yeah, we then had senior bankers and investment specialists talking, in a very different way, in almost having some reverence for what their work really was about. How could they work to drive nature finance in a very different way, which is really the purpose of what we were trying to gather people in the woods to, and to find a way back into relationship, to find a way back to understanding our own Indigenous hearts. We are not Indigenous peoples. We have lost our connection to our Indigenous roots. 2,000 years ago in this country, when Romans deliberately destroyed the first colonization, that was when we lost our Indigenous roots for most people in this country. And so we have to find our way back into a remembering of what it is to be in relationship to the earth, to each other, and to finding a different path forward. But when you sit in these deep, deep experiences, my my own experience of that is actually it opens up other possibilities. We can start to dream very differently. We can start to imagine the future differently compared to when we are just stuck in our heads, which is what so often we are doing in our labs or in consulting firms that are helping advise governments and businesses of how we're going to solve these great problems. We have to get out of our heads and back into our hearts if we're really going to find a way forward. So what would bringing culture, celebration, ritual look like back in our lands? And this is Wytham Woods, which is just on the edge of Oxford. For those who don't know, it was bequeathed to the university actually through a sort of tragedy, a loss of a child. And here is a place where we are in discussion about how could you bring culture back, how could you bring ceremony back into the woods, how could we gather and bring more art and more musicians into the woods to actually be in relationship to one of the most studied woodlands anywhere in the world, given its proximity to the university, but to start weaving the science and all the deep understanding we have of the functioning of the wood and the species and the diversity of the wood, but also then bringing the cultural and the ceremonial aspects of how we might bring that together. So that's something we're exploring. And the last slide I have is to then say that this is what I'm now starting to work with a number of wonderful collaborators on to bring into being. In June, we will launch the Astara Collective, which is about sort of coming back into relationship with life, creating these spaces where we can have very different conversations about nature recovery, because I think without that, we will not make the progress if we just continue to drive straight on at the speed that the current economic system and all of the current existing tools and approaches are taking us. So much more to say on that, but I'm conscious I've talked for far longer than I had ever intended, again, out of practice, but so apologies for that. But I don't know if we have a few minutes for questions, and but thank you for your attention.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Justin. It was definitely worth keeping you going as long as you wanted to keep going. And I think we'll have time for about 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll go to drinks around the corner. So feel free to stick around for more informal talks. And I should say, also throughout your talk, I felt how privileged we are to have you on the advisory board of our Living Centre, because so much of what you said was resonating so profoundly. I'll just kick off with a question. I think you touched upon it in your last comments. That we can have all of this intimate personal collection of land, but we're still stuck in the cogs of this global system that we seem to be, in many cases, just powerless to change. So we could have wonderful local connection and still be in an economy that's destroying the planet. And you mentioned a bit, having the CEOs and the business leaders in these points could be ways of changing that. How do we bridge that discrepancy between our local regeneration and our planetary system that's so destructive?
It's a great question, Yadvinder, and I should have said at the beginning, I don't have any answers, and I'm certainly not speaking the truth either. This is my truth. This is what is real and alive for me. But I think in creating spaces where more of these leaders can have a deeper connection, then we can have a different quality of conversation. Those leaders are already spending time to have these conversations, but they're typically sitting in a windowless conference room, and they're stuck in their heads, and they're stuck in their existing ways of thinking and being. So I've been in Switzerland the last few days exploring with some renegades from the World Economic Forum who are looking at how you can co-opt parts of that system to actually still convene some of the CEOs and some of the ministers and the people who are there. So there is a sort of way that you can start to have a very different type of conversation, a different dialogue. But I'd say, and then the second piece of that is, let's not expect that leaders and CEOs and heads of state are actually going to be the ones who solve this. One of my reflections of the last few months has been, the closer you get to the center, actually, the less incentive there is for people to change, because power and privilege has a real hold on them. So it's even harder for them to imagine, and where some of the more exciting, interesting things are actually occurring on the edges, on the fringes of what's there. And so what I would also say is this is not just about creating spaces for these senior leaders, this is about creating spaces for all of us, because then together, if we, and this is why the collective is important, actually by sort of bringing more people together, we can start to dare to imagine a very different future. And so coming into, again, for me, the point is actually coming into slowing down and coming into deeper connection with nature is what enables us to think differently, because actually we're not just thinking with our head, we're thinking, it's a sort of an embodied thinking and a thinking that's much more heart-centered. So again, it's not an answer, but it's definitely something I'm very, very conscious of and thinking that through.
Good. Yeah, we can open up to questions. Martha and then Connie. Oh, no, that's okay.
Thank you. That was really exciting. I have lots of thoughts, but I was just thinking, I was going to say, what would you like to see the Leverhulme Centre maybe doing differently? You've been on the board, you've been going through this personal journey for the last 9 months. Is there anything different that you'll be, bringing to the board now compared to before that?
Right. I mean, I think I've already started to try and bring a little bit more disruption to the board. I think as I reflect and I start to own kind of what my gifts are, I think one of it is how do we actually have the courage to step into these spaces without knowing, right? Because we don't know where this leads, but I do know that if we just carry on with where we are, then we're not going to get where we're trying to get. And so certainly one of the areas is the finance program, right? Much of the finance work we're doing is still within the realm of how do we make nature markets work, and how do we finance this in a conventional way. And I think the sort of thinking much more radically around how that finance agenda needs to work and how we can support much more bottom-up finance initiatives is one of the areas I'm going to push harder on. The community work I think is so important, how we can genuinely partner with and learn from communities and that deep relationship to the land. That's, there's other examples that I could use from Beyond Action Andena, but those examples are so rich in terms of actually how we're bucking this just being a market-based approach to how this could work. Trees for Life is a sort of more hybrid approach. It's certainly using some carbon market, but it's deeply rooted in the communities. So it's these things I think are going to be so important. And I think clearly Oxford's voice is so important, to be thinking much more boldly about where current approaches are taking us, given what we know needs to happen for nature recovery. And so I'm just going to be encouraging more ambition, more bolder thinking, to the extent that the board is willing to hear that.
Great, and thanks, Martha, because that was definitely a part of my question. I was going to make a comment and then a question, because I think in the conservation space, and certainly when we're talking about natural capital markets, I often hear this word science being used as if it's one thing. Actually, I mean, so especially if you think the social sciences, humanities, everything else, academics is actually really diverse. So I just wonder too, if we're overlooking that, the sort of value from that diversity, and maybe if we can start thinking, well, actually conservation science is also social science, it's also humanities, et cetera, and just what you thought about that. And then also, it's really what Martha was saying is, what can we as researchers do? What kind of research would be helpful? But I think you were just speaking to that. So I guess looking at putting more emphasis on researching more alternative approaches, I guess, is what you're saying. Is that right?
I couldn't agree more, Connie. And I mean, one of the things we're talking about is a sort of speaker series where we're bringing different teachers from different religious groups and different spiritual practices. How do we weave that into it? But I think so much of our approach historically on conservation and the nature agenda has been much more on the physical sciences. I think the social sciences absolutely critical, but then the humanities, how much do we genuinely kind of work with artists and poets and musicians, right? I mean, people like Sam Lee, who are, can weave so much magic and different ways of telling stories. How much do we actually sort of create space for cultural leadership? There's a great quote from a guy called Gus Speth, who set up WRI and has been a senior sort of climate negotiator or climate advisor to the US government. It says, the great environmental challenges I used to think they were biodiversity loss and climate change, and 30 years of good science would help us solve them. I now realize that the real challenge, the real crisis, is one of separation and political division and apathy. and that no amount of science is going to help us solve that. What we need is a cultural and spiritual revolution. And that's kind of also, I think, part of this. So, but yes, so how do we bring more of the humanities, more of the culture? How do we work with the Schwarzman Center around what they're doing? And I think there's so much opportunity to break out of the silos that I mean, being frank, I still see so much of the leader human research still sits in silos. There's great programs across 5 work streams, but how do we really sort of bridge across what we're already doing, let alone reaching out to the more unusual suspects across just this university, let alone beyond?
Thanks, Justin. That's brilliant. I wanted to ask you about your philosophy of time. And what I mean by that is, you know, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, right, this sort of unpicking the 500 years of commodification of the Western mind is a slow, long task. I mean, you talked about slowing down.
Yep.
And I guess when people say to you, we only have a short window of opportunity, we've only got 10 years, we're going to go over these planetary boundary tipping points, there's urgency, yet this is a slow game that you're talking about here. How do you respond to that? How do you think and feel about that tension?
That's such a great question. I'm almost tempted to ask you how I should think about that as the author of the good answers to right. What does that mean? But I mean, a couple of quick thoughts. There's a wonderful quote from a Nigerian trickster philosopher called Bayo Kumalafe. If you haven't come across some of his work, it's really quite challenging and really sort of turn or spins your head. But so Bayo says, you know, the times are urgent. You know, let's slow down, right? Because my experience of being in the various roles, whether it was in finance, whether it was in big NGOs, whether it was in the World Economic Forum, right, is like you are constantly caught up in this frenzy of action, right? You know, and I know it's the same for many of you as researchers in the academic context as well. So right, but within that frenzy, how can we possibly have the space to think and to really do the deeper reflection of where we are and what's working, what's not working? And so, and the greatest gift for me, and I absolutely own the privilege of being able to step back for 9 months to really stop, is the spaciousness that's come in and to be able to see and think about the world in a very different way. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. But the real answer to your question is, of course, you know, there's at least, we've got to be operating at least 2 speeds, probably many more. But we have to, you know, there are things that we need to do today that are urgent and important to fix the system. And we need to be stretching time and thinking very differently. And I think a huge part of it, to my mind, is, you know, and again, I'll own it personally, is the drive. Part of the drive is because I want to fix it. I want to be the person who's coming up with the answer. I want to sort of, and so that drive for approval is a huge part of what's there, and the drive that I'm going to fix this. And as you just said, this is at least 500 years, if not 2,000 years in the making of kind of how we got to this point. And a little bit like the cathedral builders of centuries ago, we need to start thinking that this is not something that's fixed by 2030. I think the 2030 language is so unhelpful. I mean, think how much stress and grief that is creating for particularly the younger generation, that we're all screwed if we haven't solved this by 2030. And that's not to diminish the magnitude of the problem and the grief of what we stand to lose, but the idea that we're going to fix this, the complex systems that in the next 6 years or even 10 years, when we started you know, talking about it in 2020, I mean, it's crazy. And it drives, I think, some of the worst behavior that we're seeing that actually probably pushes us further away, and it certainly drives some of the polarization we're seeing. So finding a way of holding these different, you know, spatial dimensions and starting to be able to think deep time, again, not to idealize everything from the Indigenous world, but I'm speaking to a group in California later tonight that work for the 7th Generation Fund, right? That the idea that they are thinking 7 generations ahead, I mean, we can't think 3 months ahead in terms of how the capital markets work.
So Robin, as our philosopher of time here, I'd like you to have your thoughts on this. Pass the microphone back.
I'm not sure I've got any thoughts. I think they've just been thought for me by Justin. I mean, I'd say something very similar, actually, to recognize that humans have a capacity to operate on multiple time horizons. Yeah, we check our phones, but we can also care about our children and plant a tree knowing that the shade it will grant will be benefited. The benefit will go to the generations ahead. And I think it is something about developing a kind of temporal intelligence, as long as as well as an emotional intelligence, recognizing that we need to kind of develop a kind of a slow time mastery of time, to recognize how to move across these different dimensions, how to operate on these different scales. I think we can be cathedral builders, but also be dealing with the urgencies of today at the same time. Maybe not any one individual can do all of those things at the same time, but I think your kind of answer is where I would position myself too.
Thank you. Great talk. Nice to see you again. I think linking a little bit up with the two questions that have just been asked. Firstly, about time, I think that the answer is really good. I mean, because it also links in with the question of academia, right? Like who's doing what and how fast can everyone do it? And then, how much is one academic, valued in a system that's so fast paced and based on, publications and doing this stuff really fast, versus, then the people who are working with Indigenous communities that it takes like 2 years for them to be able to get a paper out. But then I was also interested in, in Martha's question, because it's something I grapple with a lot myself, and I'm wondering how you're grappling with it now within the Leverhulme Centre. So, for example, I just did a short research. I won a short research grant with the Leverhulme Centre. We identified areas with remote sensing possible for restoration. Then I went to the communities, asked them what they thought. They told me what kinds of plants they would like to put there and all that kind of stuff. But now we have all that information. Who's going to do who? Because in 10 years' time, when the Leverhulme Centre is, spent all its money, those ecosystems will have changed. So as a board member, and I've been trustee myself, and I'm moving into be a new trusteeship, which is more along the lines of what you're doing. How can we bring in meaningful NGOs, but still have control of our science to have more actual impact with the research that we're doing at the same time, on an ongoing basis? Do you think that's possible? It's something that, you kind of think, you go to the communities, you ask them all these things, and you have all this great information, but it's not part of the remit necessarily of research. How do we make space for that? For me, it's something that I grapple with a lot, and I try to find it elsewhere, but then I'm overloaded with work. So I don't know if you kind of see a space for some of those kinds of collaborations within the Leverhulme Centre or elsewhere with it, like academia and on the ground work. I know, I think I saw you on Facebook celebrating with Flo Cashier from the Andena project. But so I know we have those kinds of allies, but how do we can we formalize those kinds of initiatives with science, or are they just kind of not interested either?
That's a really good question, and I'm sure I don't have all the right answers, but I would certainly be encouraging more relationship, the relationship building with these communities that are doing things differently, and really seeing how our research can actually be of service to the communities, as well as involving them. I know some of the work in Ghana they're supporting is actively supporting some of that type of thinking. So I'd certainly encourage that we do more of that. I think generally speaking, all of the conversations I have with communities on the ground is that one of their frustrations, and this is not directed at Leverhulme, but is that so often the funding models end up where money sits in institutions that sit in the north for problems we're still trying to solve in the south, or even sit in cities when we're trying to solve in rural areas. And actually the wisdom of so many of these communities, including local land stewards in the UK and across Europe, how do we actually get more of that? How do we get more resources to them? That's one of the things I'm interested in thinking about. Again, that's not for the Leverhulme to solve, but a broader question of the funding community.
Hi, can you hear me? Well, thanks to the Leverhulme Center for hosting such amazing talks, and thank you for coming, Justin. It was an amazing talk. So I'm gonna wear the WWF hat because I work for WWF, and I'm going to ask you for some wisdom, but framing it for a WWF type audience, all the big NGOs out there. And in one way or another, big NGOs have some sort of a transformative vision, right? Some call it the 2030 vision. Anyway, some call it bending the curve. But at the same time, they're trying to work with the system, right? And I know you're familiar with that. You spoke about that, but what role do you see for big NGOs in this transition period, if we're going to call it that, or this Horizon 2, as some others would call it, in fostering, in working with the system without jeopardizing the transformative aspirations? That is my question.
Yeah. I'd love to have a much longer conversation on that, because I think it's a critical question, and so much of my work, to use the three horizons sort of language, has been trying to push Horizon 2 thinking for the last 25 years, and only to then step back and reflect how unbelievably good the business as usual, industrial dominant system that we have, not to point to any individual or individual organizations, but it just has an unbelievable propensity to capture and co-opt and continue to sort of adjust, so that actually what we have is still Horizon 1, just continuing to move forward. And I think I had a wonderful meeting actually, or I went and worked with a group of leaders from the Nature Conservancy a few weeks ago, and this tension of how much they're working on the market-based system and working with the system. Same question as you're asking for WWF, and I would say that 90+% of our effort right now in these large NGOs is focused on working within the system, and so much then gets captured and co-opted, right? I mean, just you only have to see the clamor for everybody, who can go to Davos and be part of it, right? And it's like, right, there's not a lot of transformation that is actually happening in Davos, and yet the heads of these organizations are still, and again, it's not to criticize those organizations, but what I want to be challenging, and what I feel in a position where I can come in and have some conversations with some of the leaders of these organizations, they have an unbelievably important role to call out where we are. And that fierce love, because everybody in those organizations has a huge heart for the mission, and yet we're falling short of actually what those organizations exist for. And I said exactly the same thing to TNC. I would say the same thing to CI, WCS. And it's not that there's not important, good work going on, but we have to do better. And they are conversations that I want to be in the months and years ahead. And I'd love to chat more on that. And again, it's not to criticize any of the individuals or the organizations. It's part of, we're all co-opted by the system.
Yeah, Justin, that talk was so incredible. Thanks so much. It feels a bit trivial to go back to environmental markets after like the absolute incredible juxtaposition you've given. But I wanted to pick up on one.
Living there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. On one statement, so you're saying that the integrity of environmental markets is in general improving over time. My concern is that we're fixing the environmental integrity and it's kind of slipping into greater violations of the social integrity of some of these projects. The example I'd give would be Blue Carbon's purchasing of 20% of Zimbabwe, and 10% of Liberia very recently for the purpose of carbon credit options. So where does your kind of evidence that things are generally improving in environmental markets come from? And have you also noticed similar trends that we might be slipping towards greater violations of social integrity?
Yes. So firstly, where is the Where is the evidence? I mean, I think, yeah, part of what I've seen, and again, having sat in private sector and civil society in these, right, the amount of effort that is going into how do we improve the integrity of these projects that are there, talking carbon projects for now, right, has gone through the roof. One of the perverse things that's then happening is that I went to a breakfast meeting the other day. Again, I'm not really getting invited to some of these meetings anymore because they don't like what I'm saying. But I went to a meeting and somebody was sitting next to me at the breakfast, and they very proudly talked of because they were next generation carbon. Right. And they were absolutely doing all these wonderful things. It was this big project in Central America. The communities were involved. So lots of the lessons, right? All the things that South Pole did that I pointed to, they are actually all fixable. And it could have been a great project that really supported the community. And so this type of company is doing it. But actually what we're now trying to do is, because then integrity becomes the goal, right? The push and the desire to then measure every single thing becomes ever greater, which means more science, more tools, more technology, which is not in the hands of the local communities, more lawyers and people who are structuring these agreements as to how this is going to work so that we can sort of, and she proudly sat next to me, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but of how many millions of dollars they had now spent with lawyers to get the integrity of this project right. So the environmental integrity was great. But the amount of money that was flowing to, and because guess where those lawyers were? They were sitting in New York or London, and they weren't being paid £10 an hour, right? But that's in our push for integrity, we are creating additional problems for ourselves in terms of the broader. So that's sort of one way of how I would answer it. And I'm also trying, rightly or wrongly, to not try and, I don't want to throw everything under the bus of all of that work has been crap, not because I'm proud of kind of what I've done in those markets for so many years, but there are so many people giving their life to try and make it work, and some really good people with really big hearts. I'd answer the same question back in terms of the role of WWF. I would encourage them to be thinking bigger and differently, but there are people with really big hearts trying to do this and believing they're doing the right thing. The bigger question that I think you're also asking is the dynamics of actually how does all of this work? And if what we end up with is just more, large pools of capital, whether that's from sovereigns like, blue carbon, which is, basically Abu Dhabi's, carbon play, or from large pension funds like BlackRock that have, gone and invested, tens of millions, hundreds of millions to sort of build these. If we're just going to end up with pension funds owning large swathes of carbon assets or biodiversity assets, because the biodiversity credit market is going to solve all the problems of the carbon market, right? So that's a whole conversation for another day. But if that's what we end up with, and we just end up removing people from land, and we're going to drive more and more inequity and inequality. And one of the things that sits beneath what I've talked about in that final section of restoring relationship is that people are still in the land and restoring relationship to the waters that flow through the land, the plants that grow on that land, right? And so unless we're doing that, then I don't think we genuinely change the direction that we're in. And so are the markets going to solve that? No. That's why I sort of put, we have exceeded the moral limits of market. And I think the earth is actually trying to get us to wake up to say enough, right? Now, I mean, the really good thing is enough people are now talking about nature that it wasn't even on anybody's radar, or not anybody's, but it wasn't really on the radar 10 years ago. The awareness now of nature has grown exponentially. The markets that people are now trying to sort of deploy all this money into it, and the corporates that are trying, right? Lots of that's going really badly, but I think it's starting to go so badly that people are going to say, how do we think differently? Because everything we've been doing so far isn't actually working, if we're honest. So it's not a defense of environmental markets, it's that we are incrementing our way forward, but we're so far short of where we actually need to get. So I'm not sure, that certainly wasn't a concise answer, but hopefully it gave you a couple of things that were helpful.
Okay, we'll take two more questions, one there and one there.
Thank you for the amazing talk. Something that's very present in my life these last few days is the catastrophic floods in the south of Brazil. I'm sure you've seen on the news. And this bringing this sort of urgency to this conversation of rebuilding in a new way, in a different way, in a better way, and the time frame that is, if we're able to plant a tree thinking of, 2 to 3 generations, that is beautiful, that is needed. Unfortunately, today, not everyone can afford that, especially in this age of catastrophic events, either fire or flooding. So people just are losing everything, losing their houses, losing their gardens that they could potentially build this communal existence. And so how can we now, academics, people collaborating with NGOs or trying to reach to politicians, how can we sort of be constructive, not propositions of methods? How can we actually reach out and use this time of urgency to build things in a different way, in a better way, in a more perhaps holistic way? What can we do now?
That's such a good question, and we start getting into sort of the politics of this all, and the politics right now don't look great for lots of the things I'm talking about. So a lot of what I'm talking about is actually we're going to need to build a movement, right, that is growing and is bottom up, and actually, we can start to paint a picture of actually what a better world this is, instead of people listening to populists promising some sort of reversion to some golden past that perhaps never, probably never existed. And that's also against the backdrop of at least the likelihood that things are probably going to get worse, right? And so this also then talks to, we're going to need to sit with a lot of grief, right, of what is coming. And I don't want to try and paint any picture of some sort of utopian future that we can just turn this. I think we're in a period of dramatic change. That thunder, the thunder story that I talked of, actually really feeling that and feeling what is going on is so important. It's been a key part of my journey. There was a picture that I had a few slides before of this beautiful river, the River Dart, running off the bottom of Dartmoor, and I was camped out on that river last summer. In fact, Tom was camped just along the river from me, and we had a day of biblical rain. I mean, it was, and I'd been fasting for 3 days. The rain was, just torrential. The wind was up. The river, which is this beautiful kind of, serene river, rose, I think, 2 meters in the space of 3 or 4 hours. That's how much rain came down. And so it turned into this raging torrent, and I'd been stood in the river. And actually it was at that moment that was like, I cannot just go back to pretending that this is all going to work. And it was as if the river was speaking to me to say, enough. I can't continue to just sort of sit within my privilege within the system and believe that we're doing enough. And I think we've all got to, really listen to what is happening. Right? It's really difficult to see it. It's actually far easier to listen if you spend time in, and again, this is why spending deep time in nature can be so important, right? To really feel into what is changing and what does that then require of each of us? Because if we all listen, and if we can all then stand and start talking and thinking and dreaming in a different way of what a different future could be, then that's the thing that gives me optimism, not because we fix it in my lifetime, but because we are planting the seeds, both physical seeds of the trees, but also the metaphorical seeds of actually what a different generation, what future generations can, and how we can live back, how we can live very differently. And the more of us that can do that, hopefully, the less the loss and the less the grief of not just human life, but all of life that's going on at this time. And that's there's a wonderful quote from a eco-spiritual philosopher, a lifelong Buddhist called Joanna Macy, another elder, a white American elder who's from California. She's now in her 90s as well, but she says it's only when our love, in fact, I think I've got the quote, I can even, it's this world will only be healed when ordinary people, people like you and I, when our love is greater than our fear, right? And for me, that's the biggest transition of the last 9 months is, it was not easy to step away and to step away from the status and security that the job and the jobs I've had before that have offered me. But my love, actually at that moment in the river, my love became greater than my fear of what, and again, not that I have got all the solutions or any of the solutions, but that I can no longer stand and just pretend that this is going to work. And so how can I now contribute? How can I talk as a white male privileged man of what might need to change, of what we might need to let go of to actually secure or help create the conditions for more future generations.
Last question.
Yeah, my question is somewhat related, and I'm very moved by your presentation, but I'm just thinking that I agree that it is important for us to reconnect with nature and with our food. That is the only solution. But what about the developing countries and the emerging economies and the average person who's doing a corporate 9-to-5 job and who's been sucked into this juggernaut of Western capitalism, say in India, and they are far severed from nature than anyone in the West is. Like I live in Mumbai and there's no nature in Mumbai. But we can't afford to do that. It's a luxury. It would be a luxury, and it'll come at the expense of security, food security, or future security. So most people are now a part of this capitalistic system, and in the developing world, and probably people here have the luxury to take time off, but most people where I come from don't.
Thank you. What a great last question. And again, just to own my privilege of being able to take this time off and reflect. I mean, two things I would say is whilst I've talked about Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous knowledge, the spiritual traditions of the East, of India, of Buddhism, of Hinduism, actually, I think have so much to offer us all in terms of how to live and what a good life really is. And I think the traditions of communal support and communal communities actually coming together to solve problems and work together for the good of the community are also far stronger, at least from my limited experience in India and Nepal and other countries of Asia. So I think there's a huge amount that can be offered in terms of how we live differently. I also think what you say about, it's easier in many ways to talk in this way of people from, rich industrialized northern countries. And I completely agree with that. It's also a bigger shift that we need to be making, because our per capita consumption, our per capita impact, even though we all think, oh my goodness, well, it's actually all the rich people who do this, or all the people who have all their holidays. But we're all privileged in this room, right? So it's for us to also reflect, how much do we actually need, right? One of the really wonderful conversations has been at home with my wife of what actually, we don't need we don't need as many things as, but society's got a way, the consumerist sort of mentality has a way of telling us that we think we need all those things. Actually, the really, when I step back, and the really valuable things aren't monetizable, right? We know the price of everything and the value of nothing in today's society. And so I think but we have a bigger step to take back from that in the West than emerging and developing economies. And I think it's a really helpful reminder for me to get the language right. I think finding ways back into relationship with nature. And I've had some wonderful, limited but wonderful experiences of nature in Mumbai and in the Western Ghats close by. So I mean, it's not that but I completely hear your point. How do we find different ways of promoting that change? And there's extraordinary wealth, as you know, in India that has an incredible environmental footprint as well. How do we actually, how do we all think about it? The biggest impact is from the wealthiest people on the planet. and how do we then actually, drive, find a different path forward together, but it will look different in India to how it looks here, for sure.
Next time to wrap up that. That was absolutely extraordinary. I'm sure we've questioned you for quite a while now, but thank you very much.